Hello everyone. Uh, we will continue with the course English in Daily Life, in which today we will look at block 4, the final block of this course, uh, burning issues. And in the block 4 that we will look at unit 1 and 2 in this video. The unit 1 consists of social injustice. What is social injustice? You know, what all we think of when someone says a word, when someone says social injustice, right? Let's look at this. The objectives of this unit is to understand how social injustice is caused by harboring prejudices based on caste, creed, color, and gender that we will experience in the everyday life, right? For example, how the social injustice, it is there, it is very much present in everyday life. It is very much present in the outside world, that if we go out, then we will definitely experience some of the prejudices. Let it be on caste, there are certain prejudices based on caste, creed, color, and gender. And the second, to write an essay on a current social issue, like what are the things that becomes important, when we are sitting down to write a essay on a current social issues. What becomes important? So we will look at this objective as well. We'll look at it, how do we write an essay on the current social issues, what becomes important, etc. And the third objective is to use different phrases and idiomatic expressions. So when we talk about something something as intense as social injustice, then what are the different phrases and idiomatic expressions that we tend to use? That we'll look at it in the unit. So the society that we live in is embedded with inequalities, so that we've already mentioned that you go out and there is a stark contrast between rich and poor, right? So and then we tend to see how poor are treated, right? And what are the factors that led them to their situation, right? And then we can see the clear inequalities, right? That how we treat poor, right? So how do we treat them as someone who doesn't have any self-respect, right? So that is why we call it unequal society, right? One is privileged and one is unprivileged. So only the equality will only come when there are no differences, there are no inequalities between the two people, right? But today's society, that is not how they're functioning. The inequalities exist, and it exists in a great way, and we need to tackle those inequalities. And what are the measures that we take in order to tackle those inequalities? So all these questions that we need to ask ourselves. Wealth is limited to few, whereas the large majority of the population does not have the access to the basic resources of life, like food, shelter, clean water, and air, right? So we see that every day that one is having a very good amount of food, and then for few people that the food is a lot more, that they tend to waste the food, and for majority of the people that they don't even have food to eat, right? So these are some of the very basic necessities, the basic needs that they don't have, like food, shelter. Some people have lavish homes, right, in which they reside. They have all kinds of comforts at home, and on the other hand, the many people don't even have a shelter. They don't even have homes, in which that they reside, right? Clean water, clean water is also a privilege. Only certain people, only in certain areas, the clean waters, you'll be able to get clean water, and in most of the areas, it has, you get a very dirty or mud water, etc. We don't really get very good water to drink to other utilitarian purposes. And the air, especially during the COVID times that we saw, right? So for example, people were dying because of lack of oxygen, right? So there was a shortage of oxygen, and then people were dying on the roads, but only few could afford the oxygen supplement, right? So that is why only they could survive, and the others had a very difficult time, right? So these are some of the stark inequalities that we see in the society in everyday lives. Apart from inequality in wealth, there are also other ways in which people are made to feel unequal. Discriminations based on religion, caste, gender, and color of people are widespread in our society. This is very true, right? We read news every day, the TV news, and we read it in the newspaper that the discriminations always happen, especially in the name of religion, that now we are seeing in everyday life, that what kind of discriminations are happening between the two religions, right? And then between the castes, between the different castes and the lower castes and the upper castes. So there is always the friction, and one is treated with respect and one is treated with no respect. So these are the things that keeps on happening in our society, and these discriminations must stop. And the color of people again, the white is considered as fair, right? And the black is considered something ugly, right? So these binaries completely exist in our society even today, right? So that is why these discriminations based on color should not happen. So that is why there are strong rules for racism, etc. But still that it tends to take place in the society, and this has to stop. Especially when we are talking about the inequality, what are the kind of words, what is the kind of vocabulary that we tend to use, right? So let's look at some of the words that are often used in various contexts while talking about inequalities in the societies. The first word that comes to our mind when we are talking inequality is discrimination. That we already discussed about it, right? How we treat a person or a group of people differently than others, often in a worse manner, right? So the discrimination between the castes, discrimination between the religion, right? So this always tends to happen in our society, and when we talk about inequality, discrimination is a major word that comes to our mind. Bias, right? So we have certain bias, about certain things. What does it mean by bias? Supporting or opposing a particular thing or a person in an unfair way. For example, we talked about the color, right? How we have a bias towards white than the black, right? So these are some of the bias that we have in the society, and it's very important to put a full stop to it, because otherwise the society is divided in a very unfair way. Corruption, the corruption is something that is very important when we talk about inequality, because only the rich, only people have power can do corruption, while the common people are suffering from corruption, right? So what does it mean by corruption? Illegal or dishonest behavior, especially by the people in power. Especially by the people in power, how they are illegally, how their dishonest behavior, they conduct, especially the people in power that we already discussed. Disparity, again, lack of equality or similarity, particularly in an unfair way. That we looked at, the rich and poor, the disparity between rich and poor is huge, because the rich always has a lavish homes, has a lot of resources. On the other hand, the poor doesn't have any resources, poor always tend to be there without a basic needs and facilities, right? Injustice. What is injustice? A situation devoid of justice and unfair circumstances. For example, this is always in relation to a state, right? So the state can prefer one group of people and then not prefer one another group of people. So this is injustice. So in order to be a just society, it is important for everyone to give equal privileges. So this is the word injustice. Disproportion, being too large or too small in comparison to something else, right? So when we talk about food, that we already discussed, that while someone has a lot of food, the other has no food at all. So this is disproportion. So that is why the wealth or food or whatever it is, it should be proportionate in order to become a just society, in order to be an equal society. So how do we write a report on the current social problems around us, and what are the points that we need to keep? Because we all know that the social problems exist, and then some people are very interested in writing about such problems. How do we write a report on such problems? First, a report needs to be informative and educative. It's very important to make sure that the report is informative and educative. Otherwise, nobody is going to believe the report. So that is why that it is important to mention all the informations and make it educative. Also, the information should be laid out clearly and authentically. It must express facts as well as feeling and emotions, right? So if there is no feelings and emotions, then the reader would not be able to connect with him or her, right? If you have written a report like a random sentences and paragraphs, nobody feels interested to read your report. So that is why it is important to include the feelings and emotions of the other people into the report. Only then it is considered as a good report. A report needs to deal with social issue in a relevant context, right? So that is very important, that if you talk about it in abstract, we talk about it in something something not in related to any particular not related to anything particular in the ground, then it doesn't make sense. So that is why a report needs to deal with a social issue in a relevant context. We must research the topic well, and it is useful if we pick a topic that falls under our area of expertise, right? So it is very important to pick the topic that falls under our areas of expertise. That means that only if you feel interested, only if you know about some topic, only if you know about something, we can research, we can do very good research. Otherwise it is better to not to talk about that area if we do not know anything about the area. So that is why only if you are willing to go in depth in that area, only then that you will you will take up the topic, and then you will talk about the specific research. And another important, the language must be clear, precise and objective. Very important, right? Very important, the language must be clear, precise and objective, otherwise the reader would not understand the language. And especially when we are writing a report, that it is very important to keep the certain grammar in our mind. For example, infinitives, that how important the infinitives are, especially when we are reporting about something. The use of infinitives allows us to write better. It allows us to add emotions to the report. Infinitives are the forms of verbs that can be used also as nouns, adjective and adverb. It can be anything. Infinitives are formed by adding the word to before the verb, right? For example, let's look at some of the examples. We want to leave early. So here we modified the verb, right? So we added the infinitives here. We want to leave early. And what is the next example? We need a superhuman to save us. So we added to before after superhuman. So what it does, that it modified the noun. Here, what is the noun here? The noun is superhuman, right? So it modified the noun by adding to, that is the adding infinitives. So let's sum up this unit. In this unit, we first discussed about the problems of inequality in the society, right? So we looked at how unequal is our society, and what are the kind of inequalities that exist in our society. We looked at different words that are used to describe unequal circumstances, right? We looked at the various vocabulary that we used, in order to define the inequality, and what are some of the common words that we usually use, especially when we talk about inequality. We also talked about how we can write reports on various social issues around us, various social issues that are bothering us, and how do we write about it, and what is the kind of language that we use when we write the report on various social issues. We have discussed about that. We then discussed about the concept of infinitives and how to use this in our writing, right? And if you use infinitives, then how that it makes the writing quite useful, and then how it interests the reader. So we looked at all these things in the unit, in this unit of block 4, that is the unequal society, right? So we will now look at the next unit of the block 4, that is make peace, not war. Here in this unit, that we will look at the objectives. The first unit, it is to how to write a diary entry, right? How do we, the diary entry is itself a separate genre, right? So that how do we write a diary entry? How do we comprehend new lexical items? And how to use different kinds of question forms, very important. How do we use different kinds of question forms? How do we learn how to write and deliver a speech? This is very important, that one, we understand the lexical terms, we understand the grammar, we understand the language, that is one thing. But how to write and deliver speech, so that requires another skill as well. So let's look at how do we develop the skill of writing and delivering a speech. How to write diary entries, right? So what are diary entries? Diary entries are record of our everyday lives. For example, it might not, it need not to be something very significant in our lives. It can be very, simple ongoing matters in our everyday lives, right? It's just a record of our everyday lives. These entries need to mention the date and place of when to show, where they were written, right? So these are some of the diary entries. It is very important for the others who are reading to know about the date and place of when to show and where they were written, where these diary entries were written. So it is very important for the reader to know about this. So that is why it is important to mention the date and place of the diary entry. People are often attached to their diaries, so they begin by writing "Dear Diary." So especially when we are, when we are writing when we are writing in a diary, it becomes very personal, because we are noting down always, almost every event that takes place in our everyday lives. Either it's a small event or a significant event, or maybe a not significant event, but everything that we will, we will put it in detail, and then we tend to use it, right? So that is why it is important to know like the date and place. And also it is, we get so attached to our diaries because it is very personal writing that we do in the diaries especially. So, so that is why, people, they just write, by saying that "Dear Diary." It becomes so personal, diary becomes so personal to us that we start writing "Dear Diary," or using any name that they may have assigned to their diary, right? So for example, if we give our any names to the diary, that we start using the names to the diary. So it is very personal. The diary writing is always a very personal space, because that we tend to put down every single very every single event in our lives. So we always tend to do that. So that is why diary writing becomes very personal to us. It gives a record of author's day and also their emotions and questions. This is very important, right? It is very emotional because since it is very personal to the writer who is doing a diary writing, it is a very personal space. So that is why the emotions will come very easily to the person, to the writer. So that is why it gives a record of author's day and also their emotions and questions. If they have any questions in their daily lives, so that will come there, and if they have any emotions, that will also come to the diary writing. So let's look at the example of some of the diary writing. We will look at the Anne Frank's diary entry, right? So you might have known. Let's look at who is Anne Frank. And she has done a extensive diary entry in her life. So that is why we will look at her diary writing in this unit. Anne Frank was a young teenage girl who was a victim of the Nazi extermination of the Jews during the Second World War. You might have all heard about the Holocaust in Germany that happened between 1938 and 1945, where a teenage girl who was a victim of the Nazi extermination, that is Anne Frank, so she maintained the diary. She maintained a detailed diary of her days. So you can imagine what kind of suffering that she might have gone through, and then what might all kinds of suffering that she has gone through, that she had put it down in her diary. So that is why it is very important to look at the Anne Frank's diary writing. It became one of the crucial sources of information about the Holocaust. See, it is not only a personal space, the diary writing, it also becomes a document for others to understand a specific event. So that we have seen so many events that has happened, and then some of the significant documents are the diary writing for those events. We have looked at it in so many places, from the ancient times to the present times, and then the same for the Holocaust. So we got to know so many details about the Holocaust through Anne Frank's diary entry. Let's read a part of one entry to it together, because in order to make sense of a diary entry, that you need to know like what kind of diary entry that Anne Frank has had put down. Okay, so let's read out. It's a very important diary writing that we need to focus. She mentions the date and the day as well, in the beginning and in the year, Wednesday, 3rd May 1944. Let's read what Anne Frank has written. Dear Kitty, first, just the news of the week. We are having a holiday from politics. There is nothing, absolutely nothing to report. I too am beginning to believe that the invasion will come. As you can easily imagine, we often ask ourselves here despairingly, what? Oh, what is the use of the war? Why can't people live peacefully together? Why all this destruction? The question is very understandable, but no one has found a satisfactory answer to it so far. Yes, why do they make it still more gigantic planes, still heavier bombs, and at the same time prefabricated house for reconstruction? Why should millions be spent daily on the war, and yet there is not a penny available for medical services, or for food or for poor people? Why do some people have to starve? Well, there are surpluses of rotting in other parts of the world. Oh, why are people so crazy? I don't believe that the big men, the politicians and the capitalists alone are the guilty of the war. Oh no, the little man is just as keen. Otherwise, the people of the world would have risen in revolt long ago. There is an urge and rage in people to destroy, to kill, to murder. And until all mankind, without exception, undergoes a great change, wars will be waged. Everything that has been built up, cultivated and grown will be destroyed and disfigured. after which mankind will have to begin all over again. See, this is so personal to Anne Frank, as well as it will convey such significant details about the situations during the time, right? So this is very important to look at in order to observe that what kind of political situations that they have gone through, what kind of what kind of things that they have done, and then how they responded to certain certain powers. So it is very important to know. So that is why the Anne Frank's diary entry is personal, at the same time it is political, right? So that is how the diary entries are made. Look at some of the vocabulary that is used in the diary writing. Evokes both positive and negative emotions. Revolt, right? That is the positive emotion. That is the negative emotion. And what is the positive emotion for the revolt? Beautiful. Negative emotion, rage. Positive emotion, cheerfulness. Downcast, negative emotion. Strength, positive emotion. Despair, negative emotion. Peaceful, positive emotion, right? Let's we will look at we looked at how some of the positive and negative emotions are expressed through the diary writing. And what are some of the adjectives that we use while we do the entry, while we do the diary writing? It is a dire situation tomorrow. It is a dire situation now. The wartime is a dangerous time. People suffer great injustice during the wars. It was a dark and dingy room. So look at this. These are some of the adjectives in order to show the intensity of the situation, right? So these situations become more intense as we use these proper adjectives to it. And what are the questions that are asked in the diary writing? Diary entries often ask questions and leads the imagination to a possible peaceful scenario, right? Many of the questions are rhetorical and express the anger or frustration of the author. For example, is there no peace on earth? This is an everyday thing, right? So we can ask in every day when we get angry that we can ask this. The same thing will go into the diary writing. Is there no peace on earth? Why do countries fight one another? When will the world becomes a family? These are like desperately seeking answers, for the questions that we have, and these are the desperately asking questions as well. These questions are often asked without hope of an answer, but there are aspirations of better days embedded in these questions, right? Some of the questions are often asked and without the hope of an answer, but there are aspirations of better days embedded in these questions, right? So for example, if we ask, is there no peace on earth? That means that there is a desperation of finding a better, peaceful world on the earth. Sometimes songs and poems also express despair and try to build hope in given situations of turmoil, also have rhetorical questions in them. For example, the Bob Dylan's, the song, very famous song, very popular song, Blowing in the Wind, which kind of expresses despair and then asks these rhetorical questions in them, and the lyrics of the poem or the lyrics of the songs are very powerful, right? It brings out the problems of the world, right? So please read the poem. It is a very powerful poem by Bob Dylan. It's called the Blowing in the Wind. Blowing in the Wind. Let's sum up the unit. In this unit, our main focus was on expressing ourselves in dire circumstances, right? So we looked at it. We talked about writing diary entries. Of course, we looked at how diary entry is made. Further, we learned about words that express negative and positive emotions. We looked at certain vocabularies that express emotions. We read a portion of Anne Frank's diary entry. Of course, we looked at how the diary entry is both personal and political. We then discussed how rhetorical questions are asked, and then through the applications in the song by Bob Dylan that you're definitely going to read, right, or to listen. Okay, so this is all about the unit. So now we will end this unit by this, and hope you enjoy the video and hope it will be helpful for your further if you are entering for exam or any other situations. Hope you will find it helpful. Thank you so much.